On March the 25th, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a Ghana-led resolution recognizing the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity. Backed by African and Caribbean nations, the resolution has reinvigorated calls for reparations from countries linked to the slave trade. This is China-Africa Talk. I'm Gao Junya. But the move has also reignited debate. Several Western governments have rejected calls for reparations, arguing that present-day states should not be held responsible for crimes committed centuries ago. So what comes next after the UN's declaration? And how does the legacy of slavery continue to shape lives across Africa today? My colleagues Jerry Oweli, Douglas Akwach, and Brian Toussaint dissect these questions and more.
Let's start with the foundation of this discussion, gentlemen. For more than 400 years, millions of people were stolen from Africa, put in shackles, and shipped to the New World to toil in cotton fields and sugar and coffee plantations under the scorching heat and the crack of the whip. Now, these people were denied their basic humanity and even their own names, and they were even forced to endure a generation of exploitation with repercussions that reverberate even today, including persistent anti-black racism and discrimination. So, as we just start, Douglas, what does this really mean for the continent?
Thank you, Jerry. In a word, I would say it's historic. You know, it's quite a momentous occasion for Africa, that after hundreds of years, this heinous crime has now been acknowledged by perpetrators, that Africa was made to go through this horrendous experience. There are no words really that can capture this. However, I think the UN decision is just one step to a much longer journey in terms of what we need to do for Africa to get justice.
And of course, this discussion is going to veer into the nitty-gritties of that declaration and some of even looking at the voting that took place, who voted for it, who voted against it, and who abstained from voting for it. But Brian, coming into 2026, this declaration clearly is not just intended to fix the past. So what do you think we should expect the conversation to steer into going forward?
I think moving forward, probably some of the bigger issues, not so much the fact that the UN and the world outside of Africa has decided to finally own this grievous wrong that's done to Africa, but now have a really serious discussion about exactly what sort of compensation is, and whether that's going to be cash or money or some other form of compensation. But I think that should be the next logical step. Exactly, we finally have admitted that this is wrong. Now, how do we address what reparations really are? Is it cash? Is it better policies towards Africa? Is it better policies towards Africans in the diaspora? Those are the things that we should be moving forward on.
Now, if you gentlemen just allow me to now just look a little deeper into the history of slavery and how it portends for Africa and what it meant for the rest of the world. Now, let's look at the gravity of that transatlantic slave trade. Now, between 1500 and 1800, around 12 to 15 million Africans were captured and taken to the Americas, where they were forced to work as slaves. It is estimated that over 2 million people died on transit between Africa and the Americas, and that's a huge number. Now, the UN resolution was backed by the African Union and the Caribbean community. Remember, populations from Africa and the Caribbean states continue to face consequences of slavery, even in the form of racial inequalities and underdevelopment, which a lot of experts say emanates back from that period of slavery and colonization. Now, Brian, even as we continue to expand into that, when Ghana brings this up for discussion at the UN and the response is 123 countries voting in favor, 3 voting against, and 52 others abstaining from voting, what should we make of all that?
I think it's rather obvious. And just take a look at the countries that voted against it. The United States, Israel, Argentina, for example. I mean, I think that's the first place to start. And I think when you talk about the United States and Argentina in particular, as someone who is from the West, who grew up in the United States, that's not all that surprising to me, given the United States' historically bad record on race relations. Going back to slavery, to the Jim Crow era, to now under this current administration. I mean, whether you like Trump or not, I think it's a foregone conclusion that his policies are not particularly black friendly. And I think that stems from the U.S. mindset regarding slavery, that it wasn't so bad. I mean, and that mindset is beginning to rear its ugly head once again. I mean, it went down maybe for for 5 decades, but the Trump administration has really made those views somewhat palatable and acceptable in America. And you'd be surprised how many Trump supporters, when they talk about slavery, they don't see it as a big thing, or although they're even more specious about it. They'll say things like to black people, well, you know what? Slavery did benefit you people. I mean, because if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, if you were still in Africa, you wouldn't be enjoying, quote unquote, the Western mindset, the Western lifestyle. And, that's, to me, that speaks of a really, really big disrespect and a total disregard for what happened.
And also considering the amount of years that are involved here, because looking at that period from 1500 to 1800 and the numbers that are also involved, taking more than 12 million people from one continent and transferring them onto another land, a new place for them where they have to start afresh, not with freedom, but enslaved, where they have to do everything that they are told. You are denied your culture, you're denied your identity. That's taken away from you entirely. And then now, these many years later, you're trying to get this world that snatched you from another continent to acknowledge that they did a crime against you, that they perpetrated a crime against your population and your race and your origin. And some of them still fight against it. And as you say, we still see those effects even now. And I would imagine even for the black population in the Americas, the opportunities that they have to struggle with in terms of just getting opportunities within the Americas vis-a-vis white persons getting opportunities, there must be some disparity there, if I'm right.
The economic wealth gap between black America and white America, that's been discussed. It's incredibly huge, and it all goes back to slavery. I mean, the reality is, you take an African, you bring him in, and you shackle him, and then another generation is born into slavery, but another white generation is born out of slavery. And even when slavery ends, what you still have is not only I wouldn't say a skills gap, but you certainly have the opportunity gap, because that white person whose father and grandfather grew up free had more access to education, had more access to training, had more access to capital, where blacks who were freed did not have those things. And over the course of time, over the course of 100 and some odd years, you have this incredibly wide income gap between blacks and whites. And blacks have forever been in this race to catch up. It's a race that we start out behind, and with each passing year, we get further and further behind.
Now, Douglas, if you look at it, even though some of these nations do not want the world to, relook at that past, that turbulent past, that declaration primarily now means that the UN officially acknowledges that slavery in the hierarchy of world crimes has no equal. Now, of course, this is a decision that was long awaited by African states and the states in the Caribbean region. Now, from an African perspective, Douglas, how has this declaration been received?
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. But before I answer that question, I want to disagree with Brian a little on the question of what needs to be done next, or what is expected to happen next. I'm not too sure that this question of reparations is a very straightforward matter. And I say so because this decision was made at the UN General Assembly, and decisions made on the floor of that assembly are non-binding. So that's point number one. And actually, when we were discussing this topic, it was one of the questions that the panelists tried to unpack a bit unconvincingly, in my view, because if we leave the idea of where that acknowledgement was made, which is the floor of the UN General Assembly, there is also the issue that this acknowledgement, the categorization of the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity happens long after the fact. And international law is very clear that you cannot criminalize an activity because a law has now come into place. You cannot criminalize an activity that happened before that law. That is the idea of retroactivity. And I was listening keenly to panelists last week. The legal person on the panel appeared very convinced that the decision of the General Assembly suffices. But again, you will see that the Europeans never voted. Largely, of course, many of them were former colonizers, you know. And they were citing legal and philosophical concerns. And I think they are hedging their bets on the idea that the law cannot be applied retroactively. So in my view, I do not see a very straight path towards compensation and reparations going forward. But having said that, I was also interested in finding out why Ghana, Jerry, Brian, why Ghana? There are 54 African countries, but why Ghana? But when I look, I see that Ghana actually is called the gateway to Africa, and that there are about 36 slave forts and castles, including Cape Coast and a place called Elmina in Ghana. So it's like Ghana was the theater, was one of the theaters, one of the main theaters of slavery and slave trade. And in that country, where millions of Africans were enslaved, they passed through something called the door of no return. Meaning, once you pass through that door, you sail to the Atlantic and to lands that Africans never knew anything about. So this, for me, is the significance of Ghana. And in a sense here, really, Ghana is like South Africa when it comes to issues of apartheid. Of course, South Africa also was a victim of slave trade. And I remember not too long ago, Cyril Ramaphosa was involved in the burial of the remains of some slaves that were kept in one of the museums in Europe, I believe in Netherlands. So when you talk about apartheid in South Africa, it's the same as talking about in Ghana. That is what slavery means for them. They were at the epicenter. They were a theater of slave trade. And then therefore it is very important that a choice of a country like Ghana was made to spearhead Africa's campaign on this front. And I'm just curious, Brian, being an African American, talking about Latin America, Brian, and particularly Argentina having refused to vote. And Jerry, I've always been curious about why is there no black player in the Argentinian national team? I have never seen, and yet it is a country with, yet it is a country with the descendants of slaves. So that tells you how racist that country is, and therefore it comes as no surprise to me that they voted against this historic decision at the General Assembly.
Allow me, Douglas, to just expand on whatever it is that you're trying to lay a basis for. And I have looked at some of the reactions that have been coming in from some of these European players. And in the UK, the Reform Party, which is Nigel Farage's party, said that in the event that it got power, it would deny new visas to people from the countries that are seeking slavery reparations from Britain. Now remember, Britain is estimated to have transported roughly 3 million African people across the Atlantic to work as slaves within its lands before that practice was abolished in the 1800s. So when you're getting reactions from some of the leaders in the European countries such as these, do you really think there's going to be a sober conversation going forward in the terms of Africa pushing for reparations?
Well, interesting question, Jerry. It just tells you so much about the fact that there was slavery and slave trade, but there is also modern day slavery, or an idea of looking at Africa and Africans in ways that then do not make them equal. When you see some of the barriers, some of the borders that European countries are erecting on migration, then it tells you so much about this resentment. And then, therefore, I do not think that these discussions about reparations are going to be smooth sailing. already this that Farage decision, that Farage pronouncement, is an indication to you of the unwillingness, number one, not just to refuse to acknowledge, but also to refuse to do something about this atrocity.
And also now, when you look at this decision also, Brian, coming at the level of the General Assembly, remember, one of Africa's main objectives from 2025 spilling into 2026 was to try and reform the UN as it is. And that includes also reforming the Security Council, where, remember, Africa has no representation at all. And I would imagine these are some of the things that stem from that period, the colonial period, the slavery period, where Africans are perceived to be of lesser importance to humanity. And so when Africa now starts pushing for this representation, even at the United Nations Security Council, when Africa is pushing for these colonial countries to acknowledge and compensate them for the period in which its population was enslaved, do you think then that these are conversations that probably should go in tandem?
Of course. I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea at all. And if we're going to have a conversation about reparations, particularly at the UN level, I think even a great place to start was that, if we're going to really go forward on this, it's long overdue for a permanent African seat on the council. I mean, it doesn't really matter to me which country it is, but if you're really, really serious about righting this great wrong, power is the first place to start. And if there's not an African voice, a permanent African voice on the UN Council, then it's all just talk, in my opinion. It's a nice thing to say because we're in this age where the greater country out of the greater world outside of Africa, has come to their Jesus moment, and it's time for a real big mea culpa. Let's hug it out and let's move on. But as you know, talk is cheap. It's really where you put your money where your mouth is, your actions are. Once again, reparations is about power and about inclusiveness, and you can't really be serious about righting that wrong without having a permanent African voice on the council.
Mm. And as Douglas says, of course, decisions that are made at the General Assembly level are really not legally binding. But if we were to make it to the Security Council, Douglas, it would have more weight. But then, how would we get this to be taken seriously if we are not there?
Actually, you see, this is very interesting because this exactly are the questions that were being asked on the Talk Africa panel. One of the questions that was asked to the Ghanaian guest was, so why did you choose the General Assembly, knowing very well that its decisions are not binding? Why didn't you go for the Security Council? And the answer, when made, appeared very straightforward. The idea of the veto, that conversation would never have made any headway on the Security Council because of the veto. America wields a veto power, and America voted against this decision. So America would have straight away vetoed it. Of course, many global South countries voted with Africa on this matter. And then therefore even countries like China that have a veto would then have stood with Africa on this decision. But that path was already blocked by the idea that some countries wield the veto power and that these countries were very uncomfortable with the idea of declaring this atrocity the gravest crime against humanity. And of course, this again makes the case for Africa about representation. Representation not just at the UN General Assembly, but representation also at the Security Council. And I think there have been movements, back and forth movements. Sometimes we make 3, 4, 5 steps forward. Sometimes we make 10 steps backwards. And I think the previous 2 years, 2024, 2025, the question of Africa's representation at the Security Council has really been up there. And however, not much progress. In fact, one of the people that has backed the idea of Africa having a seat at the Security Council is the UN Secretary General himself. So therefore, Africa has got a lot of goodwill in terms of having a slot, a permanent seat at the Security Council. Of course, it would be interesting had Africa, when this matter was coming up, had Africa had a seat at the Security Council, maybe the turn of events would have been completely different.
I just want us to look now at slavery as it is. You know, a lot of people, when they listen or hear slavery, they just think of, you know, someone taken from Africa, put in the Americas, and they're put in cotton fields, and they're told, now you have to produce cotton. But it was far worse than that. We have, if you just try to access part of the history that is accessible to us, we have documentation on Africans that were, you know, went for days without eating. We had people who were punished in severe manners. So we have cases of limbs being cut. We have cases of people even being snatched their children when they're still very young so that they can start being shaped to become good slaves. And it was far much worse than what it is in some people's mindsets as it is now. So, Douglas, I just want you to just help us break down the complexities of slavery as we understand it now and as is accessible in the history that we have right now as Africa.
That's a very good question, Jerry. You know, many things happened. There is a way Africa is still traumatized by slavery. But let me take the economic angle as an example of how slavery reconfigured Africa. You know, Africa is still being seen today as a place where we only do extraction. A place that supplies resources to other countries. So that extractive idea that Africa can only be a place where we get raw materials has its roots in slavery. And even if you look at the earliest development of the infrastructure that was used to ferry the slaves, they basically were built into the regions where slaves were taken and ferried to ports. So those structures defined our later economic, development patterns that go inland, get slaves, ferry them to the port. So it consigned Africa to a source of raw materials. So that is one consequence that we are still having today. But it also took away Africa's identity. You know, up to today, we are struggling as Africans with our identity because we had a political model imposed on us. We had religion imposed on us. We have an education system imposed on us. So everything that was indigenous, everything that was African was destroyed during this period. So this is a consequence that Africa is still bearing. Now, even if you look at the African society, it even brought things like suspicion because Africans themselves actively participated. And this is really, really traumatizing. You know, when we talk about slave trade, white people coming to snatch and chain and take away Africans, sometimes we forget that the Africans themselves played a key role. Who identified markets, who identified the suitable men to be shackled, to be taken away. It was Africans themselves. Now, this suspicion bred hate, you know, and tore the cord that bound African countries together. So even today, in present-day Africa, we still have this idea that some communities are to be feared, there is suspicion and things like that. So it brought this deep-seated, you know, animosity between Africans. It was the basis on which the colonizer built what we call divide and rule. So the people who helped the slave traders, you know, get the men, fit men to carry away, are the same people who then became home guards to the colonialists. So these are some of the lasting legacies, some of the lasting effects of slavery on the African continent.
Now, the General Assembly affirmed the importance of addressing historical wrongs affecting Africans and people of the diaspora in a manner that promotes justice, human rights, dignity, and healing, while also emphasizing that claims for reparations represent a concrete step towards remedy. Now, Brian, off the top of your head, looking at the situation as it is now, what options exist for Africa to sort of get a unified global response that is acceptable to the slavery issue to the African population?
I think it's going to be a little bit difficult. I mean, there are 54 different countries, so therefore there are 54 different perspectives on this issue. I think the first place to start, and I hate to keep beating a dead horse, but I do think that addressing this from an economical sense is the best way to go. And my reason for that is if you remember, you go back to the end of World War II, Israel, the third country which voted against this, they received over $3 billion from the world to repatriate every Jew that was displaced from Europe during the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And they received additional monies to help rebuild their economy, to help get it started. And as we all know, Israel basically was birthed shortly after the war. So the idea that you cannot find money to pump into Africa to help rebuild itself, to help right all those colonial wrongs is simply something that I do not accept. If you did it for Israel, and the fact that Israel voted against it sounds really, really hypocritical to me, based on how much money it received because of reparations through the Holocaust. The idea that you can't do that for Africa is something that's just wrong. That's just the idea that you can't do that. I don't accept. I can accept that you don't want to do it. I can accept that the countries of Europe, they're troubled by this, and yes, I can understand a diplomatic perspective of it, but I think it's far more financial. We don't want to pay for this crime we committed. That's my thought. And I think moving forward, Africa needs to be united in the sense you committed a crime, your punishment is righting this wrong. Whether it's through financial means, whether through political means or policy means, I don't care. But you wronged this continent. You owe us.
And I want us to stay on that topic, Douglas, because that's a very important bit that Brian is bringing up. But also, before we expand on that further, let's listen into what one of the panelists on the weekend show had to say about this. And this is Professor Godwin Sikanku, who is a political scientist and a professor of journalism and media studies. This is what he had to say on that weekend show for Talk Africa.
That we are not coming in here with a begging basket. We are not coming in here with a begging bowl from a victim perspective. It is to recognize very important characteristic features of the slave trade, which is what? Which is injustice, which is discrimination, which is marginalization, which is racism, which is the imbalances that exist within the global financial infrastructure, imbalances that exist within the global trade and invested space. Right. These are things that we continue to see. Even in the most advanced countries like the United States, there is still a movement of denial going on. There are still people who are rewriting the history, who are denying certain historical facts, including slavery. And this feeds into the current state of injustice, of racism and marginalization being perpetuated against blacks, not just in the United States, but across the world. They can no longer hide from the fact that there is a pervasive global injustice going on, which needs to be addressed.
Douglas, that's a very important take that he's putting there, right?
Yeah, I agree absolutely. Yeah, and really that's why I was asking, I was raising the question about the relevance of Ghana, because one of the things Ghana is trying to do is to reframe the slave trade, not just as a tragedy, but as a definitive break in world history. So we want to move away from the argument that it is just a historical injustice and be more futuristic. So I think Ghana is looking at slave trade as something that is systemic in nature, and the scale of the trade created what he is referring to as a racialized economic system that still underdevelops Africa up to today. And I heard you asking Brian about what is it that should be done at a continental level that should really address Africa's concerns. And I think it's precisely what Professor Sikanku is talking about there, that we need to look at the economic aspects and the ways in which the global economic order is structured in a way that keep marginalizing Africa. If you take, for example, the cost of money, we have this idea of always looking at Africa as risky. And these are all in that mindset, you know, that slavery mindset, that colonial mindset, that if you put your money in Africa, you are risking your investment. And then, therefore, the cost of investment in Africa gets very high. So that's something that needs to be addressed in futuristic terms. We also need to look at issues, for example, of debt, you know. So when we talk about reparations, for example, we don't just want, you know, cash compensation. Reparations can go beyond cash compensations and address issues of eternal debt, you know, forever debt, debts that were borrowed and can never be repaid, particularly from the Western world, from the Bretton Woods institutions. First of all, the debt is costly. Secondly, you can never completely pay that debt. These are the ways, in my view, in which reparations should be addressed. Let's reform global institutions of governance. Make Africans participate. I know institutions like the World Bank and the IMF have been trying to incorporate Africans, you know, 2 or 3 more seats here on the board. Africa has been included in the G20. You know, we have South Africa in the G20. We have the African Union as a member of the G20. Sometimes these are merely optics, while the structures, you know, the structures that entrench these systems that continue to enslave Africans remain in place. So when we talk about compensation, when we talk about reparations, I think it should be a wider issue of looking at the structures that still weigh Africa down.
And as Brian was saying, that only begins when Africa has a seat at that table where that discussion is actually happening.
Yeah, but you see, there is a lot of hope here. Look, 123 countries, Brian, voting with Africa against about 53. So it means that support can be mobilized, you know. We just need to galvanize that support, you know, to lobby more, because the sense that this wrong should be addressed is present. It's acknowledged. It's accepted.
Yes, but then Douglas, at the level where you are mentioning the countries that have veto powers at the Security Council, I think already looking at the voting patterns, Africa is already outnumbered there. So how do you then rally all these guys, and yet we fail to rally these other people who we know have that might? These are the same people who will go into these global financial institutions that you're mentioning and make sure that African countries, whenever they come to them to borrow, to these institutions to borrow, they are given higher interest rates. And yet the developed nations that have that money have really, really low interest rates.
You see, the solution to this issue, Jerry, is multilateralism. And you know the biggest, the country that is the one that is hell-bent on destroying multilateralism, that's the United States of America. I think even when you look at things like trade, even if you look at things like dealing with conflicts, they are multilateral issues. Even if you look at things like global health security, these are multilateral issues. So I think the only way that Africa can get redress is through the approach of multilateral systems, as opposed to trying to lobby one country here, another country there. So the approach should be multilateral. Yes.
But also, as we're looking at slavery, Brian, right now the conversation is much more focused on the slavery that happened in the 1500s, in the 1800s. But there's still slavery that goes on in the world even now. And that is something that the International Labour Organization has captured very well. And one of its latest reports shows that more than 50 million people worldwide are still victims of modern slavery, with women and children remaining disproportionately vulnerable. Although modern slavery is not defined in law, it is used as an umbrella term covering practices such as forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, and human trafficking. Essentially, it refers to situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, and or abuse of power. Now, on this front, no region is actually exempt from the problem. whether it's Africa, whether it's the Americas, whether it's Asia, everyone is actually involved here. It's mentioned in that report. Asia and the Pacific have the highest number, with 15.1 million people enslaved, followed by Europe and Central Asia at 4.1 million. Africa accounts for 3.8 million, and the Americas 3.6 million, with the Arab states taking about 0.9 million. Now, Brian, even as the UN pushes for reparations for historical slavery, where does this current situation, with the numbers that we're mentioning here, leave the UN?
With his hands tied, quite frankly. My personal opinion, when you talk about modern-day slavery, you're not necessarily talking about slavery in the historical sense, where you have, countries from Europe just basically just taking 20 million Africans and using it to build their economies. Here, you're talking about little players, little criminal syndicates here and there. Yes, the ultimate goal is to make money off other people, but I think we're talking about, they're both fruits, but we're talking about apples and oranges here. So I think when you're addressing modern-day slavery, to speak to Dr. Smith earlier, I mean, that is something that can be criminalized at the international level or at local levels within each countries. But I don't know exactly what the UN can do about that. I mean, I'm a smart person, but I'm not that smart. I mean, that's a really difficult question for me to answer.
But also, that only proves the point that slavery, in the historical sense, really has no equal, right?
Agreed.
Jerry,
in my opinion.
let me weigh in there a little. You see, from a very African perspective, you see, Nelson Mandela once said that, and I like quoting Nelson Mandela, that education is the greatest equalizer. That education is the bridge. So what many African countries need to do, and I think a number of African countries are already doing this, because this is where modern day slavery comes from. Access to education, because then that equalizes, it's the equalizer, like Nelson Mandela called it. Empowerment in terms of once people get educated, you see how young people get used, idle young people. In Africa, we call them a time bomb, a ticking time bomb that will explode, because every year our institutions churn out these young people, and there are no opportunities. So provide education, provide opportunities, so that young people are meaningfully occupied, are meaningfully engaged. Then they become an asset for their respective countries. The politics in Africa tends to tap into this idleness, where it's easy to manipulate young people to behave in a certain way, including even on how they vote. This is because these young people are not empowered. They don't have education. They are not empowered in terms of access to opportunities. So if Africa can open the doors to education using whatever models, whether it's free access or subsidized education, and then providing opportunities for these young people to meaningfully engage themselves post-education, then I think we'll be fixing this problem of modern-day slavery. Because where does cheap labor come from? Cheap labor comes from children who cannot go to school, who then are, attracted for meager pay so that they can put food on the table. That is a source of slavery. Now, even bad cultural practices that still keep us down, in Africa, like things like female genital mutilation, or even resistance to medical practices, modern day medical practices like vaccination, is because of ignorance, So for me, education is the key, and empowerment. Then this thing of modern day slavery can be dealt with. Otherwise, we have a large pool of idle young people that the miner can tap into, the plantation owner can tap into, and so on and so forth. But if they are educated and empowered and employed, there won't be any slaves.
I'm glad you bring this topic of education up, because this was actually something that we're also going to discuss as part of this episode. And I want us to just paint a picture of what education is now with regards to the slavery bit that we are talking about right now. You might be aware of this, but let me just paint a picture for you, Brian. So here in Kenya, this is how the education system works. One, we have both all the way from elementary to secondary, even to the tertiary institutions. We have a subject called history. And a huge chunk of the history that is taught in Kenyan schools revolves around revering the West, the colonizers. And so you're always told it's so-and-so who started this. You have to revere some Briton for starting something. You have to revere an American for launching something here. And even with the topic of slavery, the way it is taught here in Africa doesn't really touch much on what went on beyond the continent. We only look at how the slaves were captured and what they did here in Africa. But the moment, as Douglas was mentioning, the moment they left the continent through that door of no return, our education system doesn't really tell us much about what they went through in the Americas or in the destinations where they were taken. And I feel like there is a gap already here. Someone is trying to probably deliberately deny you that information as an African when you're sitting in that class. And remember already, the education that we have here is something that was introduced to us by the West. The education that they found us here with, the religion that they found us here with, all that was washed away and these were introduced. And I think the idea was to try and beat us to submission mentally so that we are able to look at them as the mighty race of the world. And so the education system that we sort of have, the history sort of studies that we are given here in Kenya, I do not know about the other African countries, Douglas, but in Kenya here, it sort of puts the whites on a higher pedestal and the blacks on a lower pedestal, which already sort of distorts the history of slavery as it is and the history of the world leading to this point. I'm really curious on what the American system is, if you compare it to what the Kenyan system is, per se.
Well, for the record, we're talking about similar stories here. Black kids like myself were taught that in 1492, Columbus discovered and sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. You can't discover a place that's already inhabited. So that's a freaking lie. And the same lies that are told here, as far as history is concerned, Black Americans were told the similar lies. We learned nothing about Africa. And even now, I mean, I think it's very hard to find, even at the collegiate level, anything about African American history or African history as a requirement. U.S. history is still a requirement. You can't graduate from a high school in the United States without learning U.S. history. African history, I had to wait till I was in college to learn about that. And it wasn't required. It was an elective. I had to want to learn that. So we share a similar story in the fact that how both of our histories have been whitewashed, have been, and Africa's history has been completely, totally denied, not even mentioned as an afterthought. And when we speak about Africa, we hear about Cleopatra. And when we see pictures of Cleopatra, she doesn't look dark. She looks, at best, she looks Arabic, but she certainly doesn't look black. So yes, I mean, it's the same thing over in the United States. It isn't radically different. I would say it's even more heinous because in addition to being denied our African history, we're taught as Black Americans that we didn't contribute anything to this country. Despite the fact that Black men and Black women literally built the United States, we're told every day that we did nothing. And we're told every day that slavery wasn't a big deal. Shut up, nigger, you should be happy about it.
Yeah, I like, Brian, I like the idea of discovered, because even me in school, I was taught that John Speke, somebody called John, a white man called John Speke, discovered Lake Victoria. And that Lake Victoria is also named after, I think, a British monarchy. Then Vasco da Gama discovered the Cape of Good Hope. And like you rightly point out, these places are already inhabited. So how can you talk about people coming to discover? And this is the problem with European-oriented education, where the curriculum completely ignores local realities and focuses more on, the motherland of the colonizer, so that I learned more about Rhinelands and the Mississippi and the Canadian prairies than I did about Masai Mara or the Vales in South Africa. Yeah, so the thing is, this education system supplants, perpetuates a system that is supposed to continue marginalizing, the African person. So the curriculum is designed in a way that does not inculcate knowledge that is beneficial to local people. The colonizer wanted clerks, cooks, drivers, So that is where the curriculum was channeled, to create an education system that supplies the colonial structures, So the moment the colonialists left and some of these structures are no longer in existence, so now that education continues. That's how we find ourselves with thousands of graduates that have no job to do, because the marketplace does not require their skill sets. So we must align the skill sets with the demands of the market, because the market is shifting. So that's why in Kenya, Jerry, as you say, we keep tinkering with the education system.
But I went through.
Yes.
I'm still afraid for the Kenya situation that in the next probably 50 years, you'll have a Kenyan who has more history about the United States, about Britain, about Europe, about all these other lands, but they will not have history about their own culture. We already have such people even now in Kenya who do not know the history of their own communities, where their communities came from, what their communities did, how they got here, but they are very well conversant with the history of other people. And I think that for me is a worry.
Rewrite the curriculum, retrain the teachers, change the education system. I think Africans just need to be bold to be doing some of these things. Otherwise, nobody is going to come here to do those things for us. We must be our own change makers.
Maybe one day we'll get leadership that is not so dependent on the West, because that is also another issue. Someone is somewhere who leads us but wants to, continue making the West happy, or making the West feel like they still have a grip on the continent. Now, anyway, even as we continue, I want us to now focus more on accountability and reparations. And of course, we have already talked about this. Brian has already mentioned this, Douglas. There is already precedence. So this discussion that it cannot be done surely should be mute. But as Brian was saying it is actually acceptable for you to just say, I do not want to do it, rather than I cannot do it because you have done it before. As a continent, once we unite and decide, yes, this is what we are going to pursue, and we decide on a mode or on a pathway that we are going to pursue this through. And once we get to those discussions, of course, in the legal spheres and in the rooms that, of course, now hold some weight to this discussion, do you then think it would be relevant that we bring these issues, these examples to the table and let people speak about them?
I don't know about slave trade, but you see, the Germans, for example, in Namibia, Germany colonized Namibia. The Germans and the Herero, I think, some efforts have been made, and I think this is at a bilateral level, country-to-country level, like Namibia, Germany have engaged over Germany's colonial record and the atrocities Germany committed in Namibia against certain indigenous communities there. And I think there have been movements on compensation, on reparations. That's one example. Now, the Kenyan example has nothing to do with slave trade, but has something to do with the war of liberation, the Mau Mau. And I think Kenya successfully prosecuted a case in a UK court where I think the Mau Mau, the decision was made that reparations be paid to the atrocities the British committed in Kenya in terms of what they did to these freedom fighters. Again, that is at a bilateral level. So these things are going on. And also in the area of artifacts, which is also a key issue here. And I think over the last several years, African countries individually, West African countries, even countries like Egypt, have been individually pursuing some of these artifacts from held in museums in Europe. So when you talk about precedent, probably these are the best examples that can be given of activities that have led to some form or some level of reparations, including of payments and return of artifacts. For example, if you look at some of those West African countries that are actively pursuing the artifacts, which are really an aspect of their identity, you know, talking about stolen African identity. So there is precedence if you talk about it. But you see, the argument following this UN, this landmark UN decision, were two. One was the question of, is this decision creating a hierarchy of atrocities so that it begins to diminish, so that this transatlantic slave trade is the biggest ever crime committed against humanity? So those who voted against this thing were arguing that way, that is it now trying to create a hierarchy of suffering, a hierarchy of pain, where some tragedies, historical tragedies, are now being diminished at the expense of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, of course, there are also those who say that these documents constitute enough, you know, evidence that can be used to successfully prosecute, that they can stand the test of judicial scrutiny. But I think the test, the taste of the pudding, what do you call it? The taste of the pudding is in what?
The proof of the pudding?
The proof of the pudding is in the tasting, right? The proof of, so let's test it and see whether it works, because this is the argument that those who are anti, particularly the Western powers that are anti this decision and fearing the circumstances and the cost of reparations are making. And because sometimes they control the instruments of international justice, sometimes Africa may struggle.
And Brian, is there a risk that if Africa is successful at this quest of, you know, getting reparations, is there a risk that it will then open a can of worms? We have other instances where probably some countries are just there on standby waiting, that also went through probably similar crimes. You look at probably the Chinese and Japanese situation, where China is still insisting that they demand an apology from Japan. As Douglas mentions, there is the Namibia situation where they are also just waiting. They're pushing on their own. But if this happens, is there a risk that then it would open a whole can of worms?
I think a better question is there a risk to not helping Africa? And I think that's a question that only Africans can answer. I mean, I'm all for being diplomatic and doing things, you know, quote, the right way. But at some point, you have to tell, you know, justice, equal rights, those things are not given freely. They have to be taken or demanded. And my thought is, maybe it's time for Africa collectively to say, we want this, we'll take it, we'll take what's rightfully ours, but we are prepared to make life very, very uncomfortable for you if you don't do it. So for me, the risk here is not so much countries like India and Japan and the Koreas that have their own histories regarding slavery and all that. To me, the question is, what happens to the West or the rest of the world if Africa isn't made whole, if Africa isn't done right, if this right isn't done wrong? What is Africa prepared to do? And I think that's a discussion that Africans need to have.
Jerry, I think there is a point there, and I think Brian is captured. That's you know, like Malcolm X said, by whatever means necessary. By whatever means necessary. I think what the West and the former slave traders, who also colonized us, fear is that if this decision is given legal teeth, it can open a Pandora's box, so that Western former slave trading countries would be swarmed with lawsuits, enforceable lawsuits, that constitute millions of dollars in reparations. And I think they want to shut the door on that.
But as Brian says,
yes,
then Africa will really have to depend on collective bargaining power, so that as he says, agree as a whole continent, all the nations of Africa, that this is our stance, our stand. This is how we are going to deal with this, and everyone aligns to that. I think then Africa would have some biting force on that, yeah?
Yeah, my point, Jerry, really is futuristic. Again, let me come back to my old point of being very futuristic. I think the more realistic solution lies in, can we get cheaper money? Can we have a fairer global trading system? Can we be assessed fairly, not always as a risk-prone continent? You know, these are the things I'm looking at. You know, can we get technology? Can we be supported to grow our industries? You know, reparations can come in those forms, but this lump sum cash approach, where tons of money is transferred to a country, I think this is going to be very hard. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I think that's a very powerful way to wrap it up. And as we come to a close, I'd just like to ask both of you, starting with you, Douglas, of course, what should listeners take away from this conversation?
I think for me the key thing is history. Number one, history. Number two, history. Number three, it's a tragedy that a people should not know their history. It's a tragedy that some people can deliberately want to erase a people's history. It's a tragedy that some people want to revise, you know, the revisionists. History is our yesterday, history is our today, and history is our tomorrow.
Nice way to end it. Brian?
I couldn't agree more. I think there's an old adage that says, if you forget the mistakes of the past, you're bound to repeat them. I think in certain parts of the country, certain parts of the world, particularly the West, my home, the U.S., some of those lessons have been forgotten. And if you really, really understand the current political climate in the U.S., as I alluded to earlier, there is a segment of the country that does not believe that mistake was a mistake and that it was a good mistake. As you know, as I said earlier, you know, once again, if you forget the past, you're bound to repeat those mistakes. I think Douglas hit it dead on the head. It's all about history. It's all about knowing your history and not repeating those things.
You can find more of the discussion on YouTube and Spotify. Search Talk Africa Plus. Stay with China Africa Talk to get to know more stories about China and Africa and their expanding bilateral cooperation. I'm Gao Junya. Thank you for listening.